Hello, Mr. Ruiz, and in this video I'm going to be going over my social justice project topic, which is the issue of the U.S. military action in the Middle East. Be warned, the slides are going to be a bit wordy, so I'm going to try to compress the information as best as I can. So my stance on the issue is that the U.S. should try to use the military to stabilize the regions in the Middle East and not encourage the use of proxies to gain influence and pursue interests that don't benefit the American people or the international community. Now, one of the benefits of stabilizing the area is the fact that we can regain the support of our allies who currently think that we are trying to be an imperialistic empire that's trying to use the areas in the regions in the Middle East for political and economic dominance via the oil. There's also the fact that military occupation of the regions in the Middle East is not great due to the fact that it actually increases terrorism, since the people living there see the American military as oppressors, and they use outlets like Al-Qaeda to fight against their perceived oppressors. Then, this destabilization or the constant war in the Middle East will only increase American homelessness, because there's historical precedent of homelessness increasing in the U.S. during or after a conflict or military conflict. Example of this could be seen in a study from 1996 where 23% of the entire homeless population were veterans. Finally, destabilizing the region will cause a massive refugee crisis and cause casualties among our allies who got drawn into the war. And our allies will get mad at us even more because their blood is being shed for a conflict the U.S. started. Meanwhile, the refugees are going to suffer because their homes have been destroyed due to the military conflict. And they could starve to death. They could die of thirst. They could be without shelter for some time. And while they're trying to reach an area that is stable, they could die on the journey or be killed by people along the way. And this affects people in other countries too, because refugees, when they enter the stabilized countries, they could take jobs that the people live in those countries are looking for that satisfy their daily needs. At the same time, those refugees could be exploited for cheap labor. An example of a migrant crisis would be the one in 2015 that happened in Europe, where tens of thousands of European or Syrian refugees fled from Syria due to the U.S. involvement in the Syrian civil war. Now, on the left side, we see the migrant crisis in 2015, caused because of U.S. Military involvement in the Syrian civil war. And then on the right is a child suffering from the suffering due to the constant warfare in the area. Now, for some opposing stances is that the U.S. should not engage in preemptive strikes. The reason for this is because bullying a nation or trying to intimidating a rogue nation does not improve its behavior. This is mostly because of the fact that rogue nations would rather fight back, or not exactly fight back, but they'd rather use a bargaining tool so they can prevent the U.S. from attacking them, such as weapons of mass destruction. If a rogue nation got weapons of mass destruction, they know that the U.S. can't hurt them because the U.S. would put themselves at threat of being hit by nuclear warheads that would kill thousands of U.S. civilians. And this is exactly what's happening with Iran, because Iran is not on friendly terms with the U.S. and they're trying to build a WMDs so they can protect themselves from the U.S. because they saw what happened to Iraq, and they don't want what happened in Iraq to happen to them. So what the U.S. tried to do by trying to scare Iran into not trying to get WMDs by invading Iraq only caused them to want to get WMDs faster as a result. And this is called a proliferation effect. Also, preemptive strikes, as we can see, have not worked. Another example of them not working is 1986, where in Libya, Gaddafi increased terrorism that would harass U.S. forces even more because he felt like his regime was under threat after those drone strikes. And then there's the fact that rogue nations have no purpose to threaten the U.S. Due to the fact that the U.S. has such a vast amount of WMDs and other military arsenal that it'd be suicide if these countries tried to attack us. And plus, there's the fact that if we don't attack these nations, they have no reason to attack us because they don't feel like they're being threatened and need to fight back. Now, for the other argument is U.S. should leave Afghanistan. This is due to the fact that the Afghani people are suffering due to indiscriminate drone strikes that are killing more people than they are terrorists or the Taliban. And an official, Dave Schiffler, even said that the U.S. or military force will not crush the Taliban, and that the only way to stabilize constant conflict in the region is by reconstruction via peace. And peace can only happen once both sides stop fighting, because the U.S. will not beat the Taliban in a conventional war, because the Taliban's a guerrilla force, and guerrilla forces are known to be very hard are known to be almost impossible to destroy with conventional force, as seen through the Vietnam War. And also, another point that showing how Afghani people are getting fed up with the U.S. is the fact that large anti-American protests are taking place in Afghanistan because civilians' lives are being negatively affected. An example would be that only 136 Taliban members were killed in April of 2007, but in only a single drone strike, 51 civilians were killed, and in a drone strike after that, another 50 to 80 civilians were killed, with most of them women and children, which shows us that drone strikes kill more innocent people than they do the military targets were after. And then there's the fact that the U.S. soldiers are fighting people trying to defend their land, which makes the Afghan people makes them even angrier toward the U.S., who they see as an oppressive force after the invasion. Now, for the U.S. invades Iraq argument in 2004, they say that Hussein has caused many crimes, such as invading its neighbors, lobbing missiles at its neighbors, and defying UN resolutions. Also, due to the fact that Hussein has constantly attacked coalition aircraft flying over Iraq for decades, and that Iraq is trying to obtain WMDs at the same time, which will they are trying to obtain WMDs, and that by crushing Iraq, we can crush radical Islam. And also, Iraq. Another reason why they say that we should invade Iraq was due to the fact that the people are suffering under Hussein's rule via chemical attacks, and that we want to prevent another North Korea, because North Korea, we didn't do anything to them, and they got weapons of mass destruction. And also that the U.S. is in constant threat as long as Hussein's regime it remains. Now, for the argument that says that we shouldn't invade Iraq, is that the fact that Iraq's military is very weak because their military got stumped during the Gulf War. Hussein has very little support among his military, since his own troops are defecting and Hussein himself is in fear of his life, as seen by the fact that he keeps his military out of the capital. Also, the Kurds had a semi-independent area in the north, while the Shiites were openly hostile to Hussein's government in the south, which tells us that Hussein doesn't have full control over Iraq during the time, and that U.S. should not get involved since they have little economic interest, since oil is dominated by the monopoly OPEC, and the only political interest we have in the area is Israel, and Israel can fend for themselves, as they've done in the past. Plus, there's the fact that terrorism cannot be crushed by military force, but by constant policing, since terrorism is like crime. You can't get rid of crime, but you can lessen it. Now, for my rebuttals. For the U.S. should not engage in preemptive strikes, I do agree with that, but some sort of military action should be taken against rogue nations, such as putting pressure on them with regional allies so we can get the rogue nations to the talking table, have them disarm any tensions, and um, convince them to stop their weapons of mass destruction program so we can stabilize the region and where the U.S. doesn't need to be in the area anymore, since we've done our job of stabilizing the area to prevent any potential conflicts from happening between powers in the area. Because, as we can see with preemptive strikes in Iraq and Libya, all it's caused is a power vacuum where more people have suffered as a result. And especially in Libya, since slavery reappeared thanks to the overthrow of Gaddafi. Now, for the U.S. should leave Afghanistan argument, the U.S. can't exactly leave Afghanistan because the country will just continue to fall into civil war and continue to destabilize the region via terrorism. So the only other option we have is to form an armistice or a ceasefire with the Taliban, talk with them about ways how we can rebuild the country and restore the government, so we can have the people get back to their lives and have it where the U.S. will provide protection over or throughout the country while the country is rebuilding itself. And once the country is stabilized enough, the U.S. can pull out completely, and the people living there can live before the U.S. arrived. Now, for the U.S. should invade Iraq, in terms of military action, it's probably one of the worst things to do, because all it does is cause the deaths of thousands of civilians and blood of American soldiers. Plus, Iraq should not be compared to North Korea, since North Korea had China to back it, and China could potentially attack the U.S. with nuclear warheads if we attack North Korea, while Iraq doesn't have anyone backing it. So all you have to do with Iraq is pressure it via regional allies, have them come to the talking table, and then we can have them disarm their nuclear program, disarm tensions, stabilize the region, and we can pull out once again. The same thing happens with the U.S. should not invade Iraq argument, where some sort of military action needs to be done, and once again, we should use regional allies to put pressure on Iraq during that time, so Iraq doesn't get out of control, and we can have them disarm and dismiss any tensions that could lead to a potential war. Or Hussein's military were possibly about to overthrow him with enough pressure, as seen by the fact that Hussein's military was defecting en masse. Now, for church teaching on this topic, the church teaches that soldiers are called to defend justice, truth, and good in the world, and that legitimate defenses of a nation justifies the existence of the armed forces, and that military personnel are morally obliged to refuse any orders that puts human life at risk or causes crimes against humanity, and that soldiers are held responsible for any action they commit, and that they cannot put the blame on their superiors. Now, examples of violating church teaching is the drone strikes in Yemen, where the U.S. collaborated with the Yemeni leader to attack targets marked as Al-Qaeda. And basically, these marked targets were actually a popular movement that were against the U.S.-backed regime, and many people died as a result. And for example, in June 2011, 130 civilians were killed in drone strikes, while another 40,000 were left as refugees. Then Operation Phantom Fury was where U.S. basically only let women and children out of Fallujah, while military-aged men were prevented from leaving and were bombarded in the city. And the U.S. also committed war crimes where they invaded and bombed a hospital while also attacking ambulances and hospital staff, which were crimes against humanity. They also used white phosphorus, which burns the skin all the way down to the bone. Now here are my sources.